I'm Jack Bradley in for Steve Lance tonight. President Trump tonight announcing a ceasefire between Israel and Iran. It comes after he says Iran gave the U.S. advance notice before launching a missile attack on an American base in Qatar. NTD's White House correspondent Iris Tao has more.
After signaling de-escalation, President Trump on Monday night announcing that Israel and Iran have fully agreed to a complete and total ceasefire that he hopes will be permanent. Specifically, he says Iran will start the ceasefire around midnight on Tuesday, and 12 hours later, Israel will also start the ceasefire after a total of 24 hours. There will then be an official end to the 12-day war. Trump further touts that the war could have gone on for years and destroyed the entire Middle East, but it didn't and never will. The hopeful sign for significant de-escalation comes after Trump earlier on Monday extended an olive branch of peace to Iran. He thanked Iran for giving the U.S. advance notice before launching a missile attack on a U.S. base in Qatar. Iran did it in retaliation to U.S. strikes on the weekend on its 3 critical nuclear sites, which Trump says were totally destroyed, contrary to some media reports. Trump says because Iran gave early notice, no American service members were killed or injured. He then called on both Iran and Israel to proceed to peace, which apparently culminated in the announcement of the ceasefire hours later. Israel, despite launching strikes on Iran on Monday, said on Sunday that it's very, very close to completing its military goals in Iran, adding it too does not want to get into a war with Iran. And while Trump on Sunday asked on Truth Social why wouldn't there be a regime change in Iran, the White House on Monday called it just a question.
The president's posture and our military posture has not changed. The president was just simply raising a question that I think many people around the world are asking. If they refuse to engage in diplomacy moving forward, why shouldn't the Iranian people rise up against this brutal terrorist regime?
Despite Iran's attempt to strike a U.S. base in Qatar on Monday, oil prices fell and stocks climbed on Monday. Meanwhile, as speculations grew over if Iran will ultimately shut down the Strait of Hormuz, a critical route for oil supply, President Trump on Monday says that everyone should keep oil prices down, adding that he is watching. Reporting by Iris Tao, NTD News.
Joining me now to discuss these latest developments is Alexander Gray. He's the former chief of staff of the White House National Security Council during Trump's first administration. Alex, thanks so much for joining us. President Trump just announced a ceasefire hours ago that between Israel and Iran. He said that the war will be officially over within a few hours now. Trump's even calling it the 12-day war now. What's your reaction to this?
Well, I think that the president has shown previously in how he handled the reaction of the Iranians to the 2019-2020 Soleimani strike, that this is exactly the way he practices diplomacy. He uses the big stick, as Teddy Roosevelt would say, which in the previous case was when the U.S. took out Qasem Soleimani. This time it was the bombing of 3 Iranian nuclear sites, to show that he is willing to use force to compel Iran to follow international norms and to comply with repeated 25-year history of the international community coming as one and saying the Iranian nuclear program is unacceptable. While at the same time, he uses force for the purpose of compelling diplomacy that serves U.S. interests. There's a method to this. And I think he's shown it before in numerous situations. And I think that's what you're seeing here now is smart, very decisive, very tailored and targeted use of military force for a larger diplomatic and strategic objective.
Right, these were definitely targeted strikes on these nuclear facilities, not anything civilian related. And Trump has called repeatedly that Iran cannot have a nuclear weapon. But Trump administration officials had stuck with the message that the U.S. is not calling for a regime change. That's until President Trump recently said that he's open to it. Does the president actually want that? And why do you think he brought that up?
Well, I think with the president, just looking at his comments holistically and then the comments from the White House press secretary later today, I think the way I would look at that is the president saying, if this is a regime that refuses to make decisions in the interests of its people would have every reason to rise up against it, as they have time and time again. I don't think the president is advocating for U.S.-sponsored regime change. I don't think the president is saying that there's a U.S. role in altering the internal character of the Iranian regime. I think he's asking the very legitimate question of why would the Iranian people continue to live of their own accord under this despotic theocracy.
Well, I want to discuss another aspect of this, and that's whether Iran's nuclear sites are actually destroyed. Here's what Vice President J.D. Vance said about it when asked.
So I'm not going to get into sensitive intelligence about what we've seen on the ground there in Iran, but we've seen a lot, and I feel very confident that we have substantially delayed their development of a nuclear weapon, and that was the goal of this attack.
Alex, based on your experience, when do you think we'll get confirmation about the amount of damage done to these 3 nuclear targets on the ground, if ever?
Well, I think especially given Israel's penetration of the nuclear program and given some of the very sensitive technical means the United States possesses in situations like this, I have no doubt that we're going to start getting information, probably already are getting pieces of this that'll help form a conclusion one way or the other about what the battle damage assessment is. And I have no doubt that the Defense Intelligence Agency and the CIA and others are already being able to put together a decent picture of what the damage was and maybe what the options need to be for further attacks on the program if necessary. So that's one of the incredible things about U.S. and allied intelligence cooperation is we have pretty close to real-time information in a lot of situations, and I'm hopeful this is one of them.
Now, in carrying out these strikes, critics have argued that President Trump's strikes on the 3 Iranian nuclear sites were unconstitutional, arguing that Congress needs to grant such approval. Republicans say they were aware of this plan. Was President Trump working within the Constitution here?
Oh, 100% he was. The president has extraordinary powers as commander-in-chief inherent in the Constitution as commander-in-chief to keep this country safe and to serve as commander-in-chief of our military. I would argue the War Powers Act of 1974 is unconstitutional. I think a lot of constitutional scholars would agree with that. And frankly, Congress has obligation to raise and maintain armies and navies. The president has an obligation under the Constitution to keep us safe and to direct how those armies and navies are used. And so President Trump was acting within in my view, every reasonable interpretation of his authority as commander-in-chief.
Well, let's take a broader look at this. What position do these strikes and a potential closing of the Strait of Hormuz, which allows for the oil, 20% of the world's oil to get out of there, what does that put China in, given its economic dependence on Iran?
Well, it would put China in a very difficult position. We've seen official statements coming out of the Chinese Communist Party the last 24 hours making clear that they would view a closure of the Strait of Hormuz in a very negative light. And, let's be very honest about it. President Trump, in his first term and continuing now in his second term, has helped the United States become energy independent. He's achieved energy dominance in the North American continent. China is an extraordinary importer of oil and petroleum products. China relies on imported energy to sustain its military and civilian economy. That is an incredible weakness. And I think this shows the reaction of the Chinese to the potential closure of the strait. It shows that they aren't operating from a position of strength on the world stage in every instance. We should take them very seriously. They're an extraordinary threat. But it's an important thing the American people and others should realize. China is much more afraid of a closure of the strait than we are, because the United States has spent the last 10 years, not counting the 4 years of President Biden's green energy boondoggles, but we spent basically a decade getting energy dominance. And that's given us a much better strategic foothold than the Chinese are in.
And let's just go back to that strike on Iran by the U.S. It seems that those B-2s that were sent as a decoy to Guam, they were not technically a distraction, but a possible warning to China. What signal does this send near Taiwan?
Well, I think that the Chinese need to understand that under President Trump, when the United States has something that we are doing in another part of the world, if the United States has interests that we have to maintain in other places, that is not an opportunity for the Chinese to take advantage of a moment of American focus elsewhere to try and expand the CCP's remit to places like Taiwan. I think they need to understand that the United States has global capabilities, and the Trump administration has no intention of allowing them to try and take advantage of a momentary American focus somewhere else to do things that are seriously disruptive to the international system.
Absolutely. With more peace in the Middle East, it allows the U.S. more time to focus on other adversaries like the CCP. Alexander Gray, thank you very much for sharing your insights with us. Really appreciate it. On Capitol Hill, Democratic senators pushing to limit President Trump's war powers as Iran responds to the strike on its nuclear facilities. Our Washington correspondent, Luis Eduardo Martinez, has more on this story.
We expect them to explain to the American people the basis of the strike. What were the results in terms of actually thwarting Iran's capacity to become a nuclear power?
And I have filed a resolution that I think will get a vote later this week. Members of the Senate have to declare whether or not the U.S. should be at war with Iran.
As Democratic lawmakers push for a vote on their War Powers Act resolution to limit the authority of President Trump, Iranian missiles targeted a U.S. base in Qatar. The U.S. has approximately 10,000 troops in Qatar, mainly in the Al Udeid air base, which serves as forward headquarters of Central Command. Qatar's defense ministry said it intercepted all missiles, and the Pentagon reported that no damage or deaths have been reported. Satellite imagery from last week revealed that U.S. military assets at Al Udeid Air Base in Qatar had been moved, including over 40 visible U.S. aircraft to shield them from Iranian retaliation.
We have troops in the region. Iran has targeted Americans around the world in Marine barracks in Beirut, in barracks in Saudi Arabia. They've targeted embassies of countries around the world.
I don't think this is an appropriate time for a war powers resolution, and I don't think it's necessary. Listen, for 80 years, presidents of both parties have acted with the same commander-in-chief authority under Article 2. It's all politics. This is not a time for politics.
Republican senators have rejected the notion that Trump's actions in Iran were unconstitutional and have celebrated how they are impacting U.S. foreign policy priorities.
So what's the big picture? Saudi-Israel is more likely than ever. The Arabs are very impressed. I think we're going to see real change in the Mideast. The weaker Iran, the stronger the likelihood of peace. The Saudi-Arab-Israel deal, I think, is back on track.
It's important to note that despite Democratic lawmakers' push to restrict the president's war powers, the decision by the commander-in-chief has ample precedent. Like in 2021, President Joe Biden launched strikes against Iranian-backed militia groups in Iraq and Syria. And in 2011, President Obama launched strikes in Libya during the Libyan civil war, both without congressional approval. Reporting from Washington, D.C., Luis Eduardo Martinez, NTD News.
The Trump administration can now resume deporting criminal illegal immigrants to countries other than their homelands. Now, this comes after the Supreme Court today delivered another victory to the president. In a 6-3 ruling, the justices reversed a lower court's decision blocking the administration from conducting such removals. The case was brought by a group of illegal immigrants who were sent on a deportation flight to South Sudan. All of them came from different countries and were reportedly convicted of serious crimes. A federal judge last month imposed a blockade on the removal, demanding the Trump administration provide due process and advance notice before taking actions. But the administration says its policy already complies with due process requirements.